The sun was setting when I heard the news. My father-in-law, the man I had cared for like my own father since my husband passed away, was remarrying. At first, I thought I must have misheard. I had spent years running his home, cooking his meals, ensuring he was comfortable in his old age. I stayed because he was family, and in my mind, family took care of each other. But now, standing in the corner of the kitchen with my hands still wet from washing dishes, I felt something cold and heavy settle in my chest. He hadn't even told me himself. I overheard it from a neighbor who stopped by to gossip. When I finally gathered the courage to confront him, he brushed me off like a pesky fly. "It's not your concern, Sujata," he said, barely looking up from the newspaper. His words stung. I had no right to question him, apparently. For all my years of service, for all the sacrifices I had made, my opinion didn't matter. The wedding happened quickly. A small ceremony, nothing extravagant, but what struck me was how little I was involved. It was clear from the start that Sangeeta, his new wife, wanted nothing to do with me. She was young, barely older than my son, and carried herself with an air of superiority that grated on my nerves. At the reception, she smiled at me as if I were a servant who had accidentally wandered into the guests area. That was the first time I truly felt like an outsider in the home I had built. Life after the wedding changed almost immediately. Sangeeta didn't waste time asserting her dominance. She took over the household, rearranged furniture, threw out my carefully tended plants, and even insisted that I stop using the main kitchen. "It's too crowded with both of us," she said, her voice dripping with false politeness. My father-in-law, who had once relied on me for everything, now echoed her words. "It's her home now," he told me with a shrug, as though that excused everything. I tried to adapt, but the blows kept coming. One evening, I returned from the market to find that my room, my sanctuary, had been emptied out. My clothes, my belongings, everything was packed into a few plastic bags and shoved into a corner. "We thought you'd be more comfortable in the shed," Sangeeta explained, flashing that insincere smile. She gestured to the small structure in the backyard, the one where we kept old tools and broken furniture. "It's quiet and private. You'll like it." I looked at my father-in-law, hoping for some support, but he wouldn't meet my eyes. "It's just temporary," he mumbled. "She needs the space for her family when they visit." Temporary or not, I moved into the shed that night. It was cold, damp, and smelled of mildew. I sat on the hard cot they had provided, clutching a thin blanket, and wondered how it had come to this. I had given everything to this family. I had stayed when my own relatives told me to leave after my husband died. I had worked tirelessly to keep the house running, never asking for anything in return. And now, here I was, cast aside like a worn-out piece of furniture. The days that followed were a blur of humiliation. Sangeeta made no effort to hide her disdain for me. She ordered me around, treating me more like a maid than a member of the family. My father-in-law, once so dependent on me, now acted as though I barely existed. The neighbors began to notice. They whispered behind my back, their pitying looks cutting deeper than any words could. I tried calling my son, hoping he might intervene, but my calls went unanswered. I left messages, trying to sound calm, but my desperation must have seeped through. Still, there was no response. One particularly cold night, I woke up shivering in the shed. Rain had started leaking through the roof, and my blanket was damp. I thought about knocking on the main house door, asking for a dry place to sleep, but the memory of Sangeeta's smirk stopped me. Instead, I sat there, teeth chattering, staring out at the dark yard. For the first time, I allowed myself to feel the anger bubbling beneath the surface. I had swallowed my pride, endured their insults, all for the sake of keeping peace. But what peace was left now? The next morning, I decided to confront my father-in-law. I caught him in the living room, sipping tea as though nothing was wrong. "This isn't fair," I said, my voice shaking. "I've taken care of you for years. How can you let her treat me like this?" He didn't even look up. "Suja, you should be grateful I let you stay at all," he said, his tone dismissive. "You have no claim to this house. It belongs to me." Those words felt like a slap. I had no claim. The house that my husband and I had worked so hard to build, the home where I had spent decades of my life, was now just a roof over my head out of his charity. I turned and walked out before he could see the tears threatening to spill. I spent the rest of the day in a shed, staring at the walls. That evening, as I sorted through my few remaining belongings, I found an old folder tucked into one of the bags. Inside were documents, deeds, financial records, things I had forgotten I even had. My hands trembled as I read through them. One paper in particular caught my eye, the title deed to the house. My husband's name was on it. I stared at the paper, the anger inside me solidifying into something sharper. He had lied. The house wasn't just his, it was mine too. As the realization sank in, I felt a spark of something I hadn't felt in a long time: hope. For too long, I had let them walk all over me, treating me like I didn't matter. But now I had proof. I wasn't just some burden they could discard. I was going to fight back. I didn't sleep that night. The discovery of the deed consumed my thoughts, turning over and over in my mind like a stone caught in a raging river. My father in law had lied, and I had been too blinded by loyalty and duty to see it. The house wasn't his alone. It was a part of my husband's legacy, a legacy that rightfully belonged to me. I sat in a cold shed with a damp blanket wrapped around my shoulders, clutching the papers as if they were a lifeline. The rain had stopped, but the anger brewing inside me had not. At dawn, I made my way to the house. I didn't knock this time. I walked straight in. My father in law was in his usual spot at the dining table, sipping his tea and reading the newspaper. Sangeeta was perched on the couch, scrolling through her phone. She barely glanced at me, but my father in law looked up, surprised by my boldness. "What are you doing here?" he asked, his tone sharper than usual. I didn't answer him directly. Instead, I placed the deed on the table in front of him. "Explain this," I said, my voice steady despite the storm raging inside me. He frowned, picking up the paper and squinting at it. As realization dawned on his face, his expression hardened. "Where did you get this?" he demanded. "It doesn't matter where I got it," I replied. "What matters is that this house isn't just yours. It belonged to my husband too, and by extension, it belongs to me." Sangeeta put down her phone, her interest piqued. "What is she talking about?" she asked, leaning over to look at the document. My father-in-law's face turned red. "This is ancient history," he said, waving the paper dismissively. "It doesn't mean anything now." "It means everything," I shot back. "You've been treating me like I'm a burden, like I don't belong here. But I have as much right to this house as you do. More, even. I'm the one who's kept it running all these years." He slammed his teacup down on the table, the liquid spilling over the rim. "You don't understand how things work, Sujata," he snapped. "This is my house. You have no say in what happens here." Sangeeta smirked, clearly enjoying the show. "You really think an old piece of paper is going to change anything?" she asked, her tone dripping with condescension. "You should be grateful we've let you stay this long." Her words ignited something in me. Grateful. I repeated, my voice rising. Grateful for being thrown into a shed? For being treated like a servant in the home I built? I've sacrificed everything for this family, and this is how I'm repaid. My father-in-law stood up, towering over me. "That's enough," he said, his voice low and threatening. "You're causing unnecessary trouble. Let this go, or you'll regret it." I stared at him, my heart pounding. I had spent years fearing confrontation, avoiding it at all costs to keep the peace. But now I felt no fear. I said, meeting his gaze, "I have rights, and I'm going to fight for them." I turned and walked out before he could respond. Back in the shed, I felt a mix of triumph and dread. I had stood up for myself, but I knew this was only the beginning. They wouldn't give in easily, and I needed to be prepared. Over the next few days, I started gathering information. I searched through the old documents I had stored away, piecing together the financial history of the house. I also began paying closer attention to Sangeeta. She thought I was too broken to notice the way she whispered into my father-in-law's ear, the way she carefully planted seeds of doubt and division. But I noticed. And I listened. One evening, as I sat outside the shed, I overheard a heated conversation between the two of them. Sangita was upset, accusing my father in law of being too lenient with me. "You need to get rid of her," she said. "She's a threat. Do you know what she could do with that document?" "She won't do anything," my father in law replied, though his voice lacked conviction. "She doesn't have the resources or the courage." His words stung, but they also fueled my determination. They thought I was weak, powerless. They were wrong. I started digging into Sangita's past. It wasn't hard to find people who had known her before she married my father in law. The stories they told me were shocking. She had a history of targeting older, wealthy men, marrying them, and draining their bank accounts before disappearing. She had left a trail of ruined lives in her wake, and now she had her sights set on my family. Armed with this information, I knew I needed help. I tried calling my son again, and this time he answered. His voice was hesitant, almost guilty, as he explained why he had been avoiding me. "Dadaji told me to stay out of it," he said. He said if I interfered, he'd cut me off completely. I felt a pang of betrayal, but I also understood the pressure he must have been under. "I don't care about his threats," I told him. "You're my son. I need you on my side." He hesitated for a moment before agreeing to help. Together, we came up with a plan to expose the truth. I knew it wouldn't be easy, but I was ready for the fight. In the meantime, I reached out to a few trusted neighbors, people who had seen my years of sacrifice and knew the kind of person I was. They were outraged when I told them what had been happening and promised to stand by me. The tide was beginning to turn. I could feel it. My father in law and Samgita had underestimated me, but they were about to learn just how much strength I had. I wasn't just fighting for myself anymore. I was fighting for my dignity, my rights, and my place in the home I had worked so hard to build. The day of the community gathering arrived like a storm. I had spent the previous night going over everything with my son and the neighbors who had agreed to support me. My hands shook as I held the papers, proof of my rights, evidence of Samgita's deceit, and the weight of my sacrifices etched into every page. This wasn't just about reclaiming the house anymore. It was about reclaiming my dignity, my voice, and the life that had been stolen from me piece by piece. The gathering took place in the courtyard of a neighbor's home, a space large enough to hold the curious onlookers who had been whispering about the drama unfolding in our family. My father in law arrived with Sangita, both of them holding their heads high, as though they had nothing to fear. Sangita was dressed in her usual finery, dripping with jewelry that glittered in the afternoon sun. She glanced at me with the same smug expression she always wore, confident that this would be another instance where she came out on top. The hum of conversation quieted as I stepped forward, clutching the documents tightly in my hands. My father in law scowled, clearly irritated that I had chosen such a public forum to air our grievances. "What is the meaning of this?" Sujata, he demanded. "Why are we here?" I took a deep breath, my heart pounding in my chest. "We're here because I've had enough," I said, my voice steady despite the whirlwind of emotions inside me. "I've spent years serving this family, sacrificing everything I had, only to be treated like a burden. Today, I'm going to set the record straight." I turned to the crowd, many of whom had known me for years. "This house," I began, holding up the deed, "wasn't just my father-in-law's to do with as he pleased. It belonged to my husband as well, and after his passing, it became mine. I've spent my life maintaining it, keeping it running, and ensuring it was a home for everyone. But they've treated me like a maid, like someone with no rights or place in her own home." There was a murmur of surprise and outrage from the crowd. My father-in-law stepped forward, his face red with anger. "This is nonsense," he shouted. "You think a piece of paper changes anything? This is my house, and you're nothing more than a guest here." I held his gaze, refusing to back down. "I'm not a guest," I said firmly. "I'm the one who has kept this house standing, even when you couldn't. And I have more than just this document to prove it." I gestured to one of the neighbors who had helped me gather information about Sangita. He stepped forward with a folder of his own, handing it to me. "This," I said, holding it up for everyone to see, "is a record of Sangita's past. She has a history of targeting older men, marrying them, and stealing everything they own before disappearing. She's done it before, and now she's doing it again. The crowd erupted into whispers, and Sangeeta's confident facade cracked. She stepped forward, her voice high pitched and defensive. "That's a lie," she shrieked. "You're just jealous because you've been thrown out. You're trying to ruin my reputation." I ignored her outburst and addressed my father in law directly. "She's been manipulating you from the start," I said. "You've let her turn you against your own family, against the people who truly cared for you. And now she's planning to bleed you dry." My father in law looked stunned, his mouth opening and closing as though he didn't know what to say. The crowd was growing restless, their murmurs turning into a chorus of judgment and disapproval. Sangeeta turned on him, her voice dripping with venom. "You're going to let her embarrass us like this?" she hissed. "Do something." But for once, he had no response. The weight of the evidence, the years of betrayal, and the glaring eyes of the community bore down on him. His shoulders slumped, and for the first time, I saw him not as the intimidating patriarch I had always feared, but as a man who had let his greed and pride destroy his family. I stepped closer, my voice softer but no less firm. "I didn't want it to come to this," I said. "I didn't want to humiliate you or air our dirty laundry in front of everyone. But you left me no choice. I deserve better than this. I deserve respect, and I deserve the home that I've worked so hard to maintain." The silence that followed was deafening. Sangeeta looked around, realizing she was losing her grip on the situation. She grabbed my father-in-law's arm, her voice panicked. "Let's go," she said. "We don't have to stand here and listen to this." But he didn't move. Instead, he looked at me, his face a mixture of shame and something that almost resembled regret. "I didn't know," he said quietly. "I didn't realize." "Because you didn't want to realize," I replied. "You let her blind you to the truth because it was easier than facing your own mistakes." The crowd began to disperse after that, the weight of the confrontation leaving everyone in a subdued mood. My father-in-law and Sangeeta left without another word, and for the first time in months, I felt a sense of peace. It wasn't over yet. There would still be legal battles to fight, and I knew Sangeeta wouldn't give up easily. But I had taken the first step toward reclaiming my life, and that was enough for now. The house was mine again, not just in name, but in spirit. I moved back in the following week, with the support of my son and the neighbors who had stood by me. The shed, with all its cold nights and bitter memories, was nothing more than a bad dream now. I turned the home into a place of warmth and welcome once more, even opening it up as a refuge for other women who had eventually apologized, though his words felt hollow. He stayed in a small room at the back of the house, keeping to himself. Sangeeta disappeared, just as I had expected, taking what little she could and leaving my father-in-law to pick up the pieces of his shattered pride. As for me, I found a new sense of strength and purpose. I was no longer just a widow, a caretaker, or a burden. I was a survivor, a fighter, and a woman who had reclaimed her place in the world. And for that, I was grateful. The house was quiet now, a far cry from the chaos that had consumed it in the weeks before. Sangeeta had left without a word, slinking away in the dead of night after the confrontation. My father-in-law had retreated to his room, leaving me to pick up the pieces of what was once a fractured and oppressive household. For the first time in years, I felt like I could breathe. The first thing I did was clean the shed. Not because I needed to live there anymore, but because I wanted to erase its memory. I scrubbed the walls, swept the floor, and removed every trace of the months I had spent trapped there. When I was done, I turned it into a storage space, a practical, useful corner of the property. It felt like a symbolic act, taking a place that had once symbolized my humiliation and repurposing it for something better. Inside the house, I began to reclaim my space. I cleaned the kitchen, rearranged the furniture, and aired out the rooms that had gone unused for too long. Every corner of the house felt like it was holding its breath, waiting to see what I would do next. I decided that it wouldn't just be a home for me anymore. It would be a sanctuary for anyone who needed one. Word of the events at the gathering had spread through the village like wildfire. People came by to offer their support or simply to gawk at the woman who had dared to stand up to her father in law and expose a con artist in front of the entire community. Some were genuinely kind, bringing me food or small gifts to show their solidarity. Others were nosy, fishing for more details about what had happened. I kept my answers polite but brief. My story wasn't for their entertainment. My son returned home a week later, carrying a small suitcase and a heavy weight of guilt. I met him at the door, and for a moment, we just stood there, looking at each other. Then, without a word, he stepped forward and hugged me. The tears I had been holding back for so long finally spilled over, and I clung to him like a lifeline. "I'm sorry, Ma," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I should have come back sooner. I should have done more." "You're here now," I replied, pulling back to look at him. That's what matters. Having him home brought a sense of completeness to the house. Together, we began the work of truly rebuilding, not just the physical space, but the bonds that had been strained and frayed over the years. He helped me repaint the walls, repair the leaky roof, and plant a small garden in the backyard. Every flower we planted felt like a small victory, a reminder that life could grow even in the wake of so much pain. My father in law, meanwhile, remained distant. He spent most of his days in his room, emerging only for meals and the occasional walk around the yard. He didn't speak to me much, and when he did, it was awkward and stilted. I could see the shame in his eyes, the weight of everything that had happened pressing down on him. I wanted to hate him for what he had done, for the way he had treated me, but I found that I couldn't. He was an old man who had made terrible choices, and now he was living with the consequences. One evening, as I was preparing dinner, he came into the kitchen and stood silently by the door. I glanced at him, waiting for him to speak, but he seemed to be struggling to find the words. Finally, he said, "I didn't mean for things to go so far." I put down the knife I was using to chop vegetables and turned to face him. "But they did," I said, keeping my voice calm. "You let her treat me like I was nothing. You let her push me out of my own home." He nodded, his shoulders slumping. "I was selfish," he admitted. "I didn't want to be alone, and I thought she would. I thought she cared." "She cared about what she could take from you," I replied. "And you let her." There was a long silence between us. Then he said, "I'm sorry, Suja, for everything." I wanted to believe him. I wanted to take his apology at face value and let it be enough. But the scars of what I had endured wouldn't fade so easily. "It'll take time," I said finally, "for me to forgive you, for me to trust you again." He nodded, and for the first time, I saw a glimmer of understanding in his eyes. He left the kitchen without another word, and I returned to my cooking, my mind a whirlwind of emotions. In the weeks that followed, I threw myself into a new project. I had always dreamed of helping other women who had faced the same struggles I had, women who had been silenced, overlooked, or cast aside. With the support of my son and a few trusted neighbors, I began turning the house into a space where women could come for support and guidance. We converted one of the larger rooms into a meeting space, stocked with books, resources, and comfortable seating. The garden became a place of healing, a peaceful retreat for anyone who needed it. The first few women who came to us were hesitant, their stories heartbreaking echoes of my own. But as they spent time in the house, as they saw the strength and resilience that could grow from even the darkest moments, they began to find their own voices. Watching them heal was like watching the garden bloom, each flower a testament to the power of perseverance. My son became an integral part of this new chapter. He offered to teach basic financial literacy classes to the women, helping them take control of their lives in ways they had never thought possible. Seeing him step into this role filled me with pride. Despite everything, we had found a way to move forward together. As for me, I found a sense of peace I hadn't known in years. The house was no longer just a building or a symbol of my struggles. It was a home in the truest sense, filled with life, laughter, and the promise of a brighter future. I had reclaimed my place, not just within its walls, but within myself. I was no longer defined by what had been done to me, but by what I had done in response. My father in law eventually began to participate in small ways, helping in the garden or sitting in on the women's meetings. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Perhaps he, too, was learning that redemption wasn't about erasing the past, but about choosing a better path forward. Life wasn't perfect, but it was mine again. And for the first time in a long time, that was enough. The house had grown livelier in the weeks since the project began. Women from the village and surrounding areas came and went, bringing with them stories of struggle and survival. Some stayed for only a day, others for weeks, but each one left behind a sense of hope and connection that made the home feel warmer. It was a stark contrast to the cold and emptiness that had defined it for so long. One afternoon, as I sat in the garden trimming the roses, I noticed my father in law watching me from the veranda. His posture was stiff, his face unreadable, but there was something different about his gaze. He wasn't avoiding me anymore, though he hadn't said much since our last conversation. I had been giving him space, hoping he might find his own way to make amends. As I stood to carry the clippings to the compost, he shuffled over to me, his hands clasped tightly behind his back. "The roses look good," he said awkwardly, his voice
I
barely
replied,
above a mumble, not looking up from my task. I wasn't ready to make this easy for him. He hesitated before continuing. "You've done a lot for this place. For the women, too. People in the village are saying good things." I finally met his gaze, unsure of where he was going with this. "I'm just trying to make it a place where people feel safe. Somewhere they can rebuild." He nodded slowly. "You've always been good at that. Building things. Keeping them going." His words caught me off guard, but I didn't respond. I wasn't sure what to say. Instead, I finished with the compost and walked back toward the house, leaving him standing there. That evening, as I prepared dinner, my son came into the kitchen carrying a letter. He looked troubled as he handed it to me. "It's from Sangita," he said. "It came this afternoon." My hands trembled slightly as I unfolded the paper. The letter was short and direct. Sangita was demanding money, claiming she was entitled to compensation for the work she had done in the house. She threatened to take legal action if we didn't comply. I could almost hear her smug tone in the words, as if she thought she still had some hold over us. "She's bluffing," my son said, his voice firm. "She doesn't have a leg to stand on, but we need to be prepared, just in case." I nodded, setting the letter down on the counter. "She's not coming back here," I said, my voice resolute. "I've worked too hard to let her undo everything." Over the next few days, we consulted a lawyer and gathered all the necessary documents to ensure Sangita couldn't make good on her threats. The process was draining, but it also reinforced how far I had come. There was a time when I would have felt paralyzed by fear, unsure of how to fight back. Now, I felt only determination. During this time, my father-in-law surprised me by stepping forward in his own way. He offered to cover any legal fees that might arise, insisting it was his responsibility. I didn't refuse. It felt like a small but significant step toward accountability on his part. One evening, after we had sent a formal response to Sangita's letter, my father-in-law came to the living room where I was sorting through papers. He sat down across from me, his expression unusually serious. "I've been thinking a lot," he began, his voice hesitant, "about what you said, about what I let happen." I set the papers aside, giving him my full attention. And, and I was wrong, he admitted. Not just about Sangita, but about everything. I let my pride and fear of being alone cloud my judgment. "I treated you terribly, Sujata. Worse than anyone deserves." His words hung in the air, heavy with the weight of their sincerity. For a moment, I didn't know how to respond. Part of me wanted to lash out, to remind him of every insult, every humiliation. But another part of me saw the old man in front of me, not the tyrant I had feared for so long, but a man grappling with the consequences of his choices. "I appreciate you saying that," I said finally, my voice steady. "But words aren't enough. If you're truly sorry, you'll show it. Not just to me, but to everyone you've wronged." He nodded, his gaze dropping to the floor. "I will," he said quietly. "I don't know how yet, but I will." In the days that followed, I noticed small changes in him. He started helping out more around the house, fixing a broken chair, weeding the garden, even offering to cook a meal or two. He also began engaging with the women who came to the house, listening to their stories and, occasionally, sharing bits of his own. It was a slow process, but it felt genuine. One evening, as we sat together in the garden, he surprised me with a question. "Do you think people can really change?" he asked, his tone thoughtful. "I think people can choose to change," I replied. "But it's not easy. It takes time and effort, and not everyone is willing to put in the work." He nodded, staring out at the sunset. "I want to try," he said after a long pause, "for whatever time I have left." The honesty in his voice caught me off guard, but I didn't say anything. Instead, I simply nodded, letting the moment speak for itself. The letter from Sangita turned out to be an empty threat. After receiving our lawyer's response, she disappeared once again, leaving behind nothing but the faint echo of her greed and deceit. It was a relief, but it also felt like a reminder of how far we had come as a family. We had faced betrayal, humiliation, and loss, but we were still standing. As the weeks turned into months, the house began to feel like a home again, not just for me, but for my son, my father-in-law, and the women who passed through its doors. It was a place of healing, growth, and quiet strength. And though the scars of the past would never fully fade, they served as a reminder of what we had overcome. One evening, as I sat in the garden watching the roses bloom, my father-in-law joined me. He didn't say anything, simply sitting beside me in silence. For the first time, it felt like we were truly at peace, not just with each other, but with ourselves. And in that moment, I knew we were finally moving forward, together. The morning sun filtered through the windows as I sat at the dining table, sipping my tea. It was one of those rare, quiet moments that had become more frequent now that the house was finally at peace. The hum of life still filled the air, the faint sound of the women in the garden, my son discussing something with one of the younger visitors, and the occasional creak of my father-in-law's chair as he read in the next room. It was a calm I hadn't known for years, and I found myself savoring it more and more. As I sat there, I thought back to how far we had come. There had been so many moments when I doubted whether this house could ever feel like home again. The weight of betrayal, the sting of humiliation, and the sheer exhaustion of fighting for what was mine had nearly broken me. Yet here I was sitting in a home I had reclaimed, not just with legal documents, but with the determination to make it something better. The Women's Project had flourished beyond anything I had imagined. At first, it had been a tentative endeavor, with only a few women trickling in, hesitant and uncertain. But word had spread, and now the house buzzed with life and purpose. Women came to learn, to heal, and to find a sense of community they had been missing. They brought their children, their hopes, and sometimes their sorrows, and together we created something new. It wasn't just a refuge, it was a place where they could rebuild. My father-in-law, much to my surprise, had become a quiet supporter of the project. At first, he had hovered on the sidelines, watching with what I thought was disapproval. But over time, I saw the change in him. He began helping in small ways, repairing a broken stool here, offering advice on gardening there. It was his way of atoning, I realized, though he never said so outright. Actions, I had learned, spoke louder than words. One day, as I was tending to the vegetable patch with a few of the women, he approached me with a suggestion. "You should expand the garden," he said, his voice cautious, as though unsure of how I would react. "There's plenty of space by the side yard. You could grow more vegetables, maybe even sell some at the market." I paused, looking up at him. His words were practical, but there was something deeper in his tone, a genuine desire to contribute. "That's a good idea," I replied. "We could use the extra produce to help more families." He nodded, a faint smile flickering across his face. It wasn't much, but it was progress. As the weeks went on, he began involving himself more and more. He started talking to the women, listening to their stories, and even sharing pieces of his own. At first, they were wary of him, a man who had once been so rigid and dismissive. But his humility and willingness to help won them over slowly. One of the older women, who had suffered years of mistreatment from her own family, told me one evening that my father in law's small acts of kindness had given her hope. If someone like him can change,
Her
she
words
said,
stayed with
maybe my
me.
family
They
can too.
reminded
Reminded me that change, though slow and painful, was possible. It wasn't just the women who were healing here, it was all of us. One afternoon, as I was sorting through donations in the front room, my son came in with a small box in his hands. This came for you, he said, placing it on the table. No return address. I frowned, opening the box carefully. Inside was a small photo album and a single folded note. I opened the note first, recognizing the handwriting immediately. It was from Sangeeta. The note was brief and cryptic. She claimed she had found the photo album while cleaning out her belongings and thought I might want it. There was no apology, no explanation, just a hollow gesture, as though this could somehow make up for everything she had done. I flipped through the album cautiously. It was filled with old photos of my husband, my son as a child, and moments from our life that I had thought were lost. For a moment, I was overwhelmed by a wave of emotion, grief, nostalgia, and a flicker of gratitude that at least this piece of my past had been returned. But then I closed the album, setting it aside. Sangeeta's actions, whatever her intentions, no longer held any power over me. She was a shadow of the past, and I had no desire to let her disrupt the life I was building now. That evening, I sat with my son in the garden, watching the sun dip below the horizon. Do you think people like her ever change? I asked, breaking the comfortable silence. He thought for a moment before answering. Maybe, but it doesn't matter. What matters is how we move forward. His words struck a chord with me. For so long, I had been consumed by the idea of justice, of righting the wrongs that had been done to me. But now I realized it wasn't about her anymore. It was about us, our family, our home, and the life we were rebuilding. My father in law joined us a little while later, carrying a tray of tea. He set it down carefully and took a seat, looking out at the garden with a sense of quiet satisfaction. This is what your husband would have wanted, he said softly, almost to himself. A house full of life, a family that sticks together. I glanced at him, surprised by the sentiment. It took a long time to get here, I said. But yes, I think he would have been proud. The three of us sat there in companionable silence, the weight of the past no longer pressing so heavily on our shoulders. It wasn't a perfect ending. There were still scars, still moments of tension and doubt. But it was enough. We had found a way to move forward, together. As the stars began to the night sky, I felt a sense of peace settle over me. This house, this family, and this life were mine again, not because they had been handed to me, but because I had fought for them. And for the first time in years, I felt truly at home. The house was unusually quiet the morning it all came to a head. I woke early, as I often did, and went about my routine. The silence was a stark contrast to the usual hum of activity, with women bustling in the garden or chatting in the kitchen. I should have felt at ease, but instead, a faint unease settled in the pit of my stomach. By mid-morning, the reason for the quiet became clear. My father-in-law walked into the kitchen, his face pale and drawn. He held a piece of paper in his hands, and his fingers trembled as he placed it on the table. I looked at it, then back at him. "What is this?" asked, my voice calm but firm. "It's from her," he said, barely above a whisper. I didn't need to ask who he meant. The name hung unspoken in the air. Sangeeta. I picked up the letter, scanning its contents quickly. It was worse than I had imagined. She was demanding a share of the property, claiming she had invested time and effort into the house, and that she deserved compensation. There were veiled threats of legal action, just enough to make her words sting, but vague enough to leave us guessing about her actual intentions. I set the letter down carefully and met his eyes. "She doesn't give up, does she?" He shook his head, his expression a mix of shame and defeat. "I didn't think she'd go this far." I leaned back in my chair, letting out a slow breath. "She's desperate. She knows she's lost, but she's trying to salvage whatever she can." For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then he said, "What do we do now?" His question caught me off guard. For years, he had been the one dictating what was to be done, how things would proceed. But now he was looking to me for guidance. It was a small moment, but it felt significant. "We stand firm," I said. "We've already taken the right steps. The house is in my name. The community knows the truth. She doesn't have any real claim here." He nodded slowly, as though the weight of my words was sinking in. "I'll do whatever you think is best," he said, his voice quiet but resolute. That afternoon, my son and I reviewed the letter together, comparing it against the legal documents we had already secured. "She's bluffing," he said with certainty. "There's no way she can prove any of this. It's all baseless." "She's counting on fear," I replied. "She thinks we'll give in just to make her go away." "But we won't," my son said firmly. I nodded, proud of the strength in his voice. Even so, I couldn't shake the feeling that something more was coming. Sangeeta wasn't the type to let go easily, and I knew better than to underestimate her cunning. The next day, my unease proved justified. Sangeeta showed up at the house unannounced. She stood at the gate, her arms crossed, wearing an expression that was equal parts smug and determined. The sight of her sent a chill through me, but I squared my shoulders and stepped outside to face her. "What do you want?" I asked, keeping my voice calm but firm. "I'm here to settle things," she said, her tone dripping with false civility. "I think we can come to an agreement." "There's nothing to settle," I replied. "You have no claim here. Whatever you're trying to achieve, it won't work." She smirked, as though she found my confidence amusing. "You think you've won, don't you?" she said. "But you don't know how the world works, Suja. I've seen people like you before, clinging to scraps, thinking you're stronger than you are. But in the end, everyone has a price." Her words sparked something in me, but I refused to let her see it. "You can say whatever you want," I said, "but you're not welcome here. Leave, or I'll call the police." For a moment, she hesitated, clearly surprised by my defiance. Then her smirk returned. "This isn't over," she said, turning on her heel and walking away. I stood at the gate, watching her go, my heart pounding in my chest. Part of me wanted to crumble, to let the weight of her words drag me down. But another part of me, the part that had fought so hard to get here, refused to give her that power. That evening, as I sat in the garden, my father-in-law joined me. He looked tired, older somehow, as though the day's events had drained him completely. "I saw her," he said quietly. "I heard what she said." I didn't respond, waiting for him to continue. "I let her into our lives," he said after a long pause. "I let her take control. And now, this is the result." His voice was heavy with regret, and for the first time, I felt a pang of pity for him. He had been a victim in his own way, manipulated, deceived, and left to pick up the pieces. But his choices had hurt so many others, and I couldn't let him off the hook completely. "She's gone now," I said, "and she won't win. We've come too far to let her destroy what we've built." He nodded, a faint glimmer of hope flickering in his eyes. "You're right," he said. "We'll stand together this time." The days that followed were tense, but uneventful. Sangeeta didn't return, and there were no further letters or threats. It was as though she had finally realized that she couldn't break us. Slowly, the house began to settle back into its rhythm. The women returned, filling the space with laughter and warmth. The garden flourished, and even my father-in-law seemed lighter, as though a weight had been lifted from his shoulders. One evening, as we sat together in the living room, my son brought out the photo album Sangeeta had For a sent. moment, "Do you I want to look through hesitated. this?" he
The
asked.
album was a relic of a life that felt distant now, a life defined by loss and struggle.
But as I opened it and flipped through its pages, I realized it was also a reminder of everything I had fought for. Each photo told a story of resilience, of love, and of a family that had endured more than its share of hardships, but had found a way to move forward. As we sat there, surrounded by memories and hope for the future, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't known in years. The battle wasn't over, but for the first time, I knew we were strong enough to face whatever came next. Together. The morning light streamed through the windows, golden and soft, as I brewed my first cup of tea for the day. The house felt alive in a way it hadn't in years. It wasn't just the noise of the women moving about or the gentle hum of the garden outside. It was something deeper, a sense of peace and purpose that now seemed to infuse every corner of the home. I stood at the counter, stirring my tea, letting myself savor the quiet joy of this moment. My father in law shuffled into the kitchen, still in his morning shawl. He gave me a small nod, his way of greeting these days, and sat at the table. I placed a cup of tea in front of him without a word, the silence between us comfortable now. He had softened over the past months, his presence less a looming shadow and more quiet companion. It was a transformation I never would have imagined a year ago. Morning's nice, he said after a while, his voice gruff but warm. It is, I replied, sitting down across from him. The roses are blooming again. I think the new fertilizer is helping. He nodded, taking a sip of his tea. You've turned this place around, he said, his tone thoughtful. It feels different. I glanced at him, surprised by the sentiment. Different how? Better, he said simply. Like a real home again. His words warmed something inside me, and I found myself smiling. It had taken so much to get to this point, so much pain, struggle, and fighting, but hearing him acknowledge the change made it feel worth it. Later that day, as I worked in the garden with one of the women, I noticed my father in law standing at the edge of the yard, watching us. He had taken to spending more time outside, observing the work we did, or offering small bits of advice when asked. This time, though, he seemed more pensive. What's on your mind? I called out, setting down my trowel. He hesitated, then walked over, his steps slow and deliberate. I was thinking, he began, about everything you've done here, about how far we've all come. I stood, wiping my hands on my apron. It hasn't been easy, I said, meeting his gaze. But we've managed. He nodded, looking down at the soil. I want to do more, he said after a moment. To help. To make things right. His words took me by surprise. For so long, he had been content to stay on the sidelines, offering support in small, quiet ways. This was the first time he had expressed a desire to take a more active role. What do you have in mind? I asked, curious. I don't know yet, he admitted. But I want to start by making sure this house is secure for you, for your son, and for the work you're doing here. I've been talking to a lawyer about updating the will. I blinked, taken aback. You don't have to do that, I said quickly. The house is already in my name. I know, he said, holding up a hand to stop me. But I want to make sure there are no doubts, no loose ends. I owe you that much. I didn't know what to say. His offer felt genuine, a gesture of not just responsibility, but also gratitude. Thank you, I said finally, my voice soft. It means a lot. As the days passed, he kept true to his word. He spent hours with the lawyer, going over details and ensuring everything was in order. It was a process that seemed to bring him a sense of purpose, a way to contribute to the future of the house and the family he had once taken for granted. I watched him work with a mix of pride and relief. He was trying, in his own way, to atone. Meanwhile, the project continued to grow. More women came to the house, each with their own stories of struggle and survival. Some stayed for only a short time. Others became regular visitors, but all of them left their mark. The house had become a place of healing, not just for them, but for me as well. Every smile, every moment of laughter, every small victory reminded me why I had fought so hard to keep it. One afternoon, as I sat in the garden, one of the women approached me. Her name was Anjali, and she had been with us for a few months now. She was younger than most of the others, with a quiet determination that reminded me of myself. Can I talk to you? She asked, her voice hesitant. Of course, I said, gesturing for her to sit beside me. She sat down, her hands fidgeting nervously in her lap. I just wanted to say thank you, she began, for everything, for giving me a place to stay, for helping me find my feet again. I smiled, reaching out to place a hand on hers. You've done most of the work yourself, I said. We just gave you the space to do it. She shook her head, her eyes welling with tears. You don't understand, she said. This house, it saved me. You saved me. Her words caught me off guard, and I felt a lump rise in my throat. You saved yourself, I said gently, but I'm glad we could help. As she walked away, I sat there for a long time, thinking about everything that had led to this moment. The struggles, the heartbreak, the fights, they had all been worth it. This house wasn't just a place anymore, it was a beacon, a symbol of resilience and hope. That evening, as I stood at the kitchen window watching the sun set over the garden, my son came in. He leaned against the counter, his expression thoughtful. You've done something amazing here, Ma, he said. I turned to him, smiling. I couldn't have done it without you. He shook his head. No, this was you. Your strength, your determination. You built this. I looked out at the garden, at the women laughing and working together, at my father in law sitting on the veranda with a quiet smile on his face. We built it, I said softly. All of us. For the first time in a long time, I felt truly at peace. The house was more than just a home now. It was a legacy, a testament to everything we had overcome. And as I stood there, surrounded by the life we had created, I knew we were finally where we were meant to be. The sky was a brilliant shade of orange as the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the garden. I stood on the veranda, my hands resting on the wooden railing, watching the women move about the yard. Some were harvesting vegetables, others tending to the flowers, and a few sat in a circle under the old banyan tree, sharing stories and laughter. The sound of their voices carried through the air, mingling with the scent of blooming jasmine. It was a moment of serenity, one I hadn't known could exist in this house after everything we'd been through. My father-in-law joined me, his step slow but steady. He leaned against the railing beside me, his face lined with age and thought. For a long moment, we stood in silence, simply taking in the scene before us. It was a silence that no longer felt heavy or awkward. It was filled with a shared understanding, a quiet acknowledgement of how far we had come. You've done something remarkable here, he said finally, his voice soft but firm. I glanced at him, surprised by the emotion in his tone. We all have, I replied. It wasn't just me. He shook his head, a small smile playing on his lips. It started with you, he said. I see that now. You took what was broken and turned it into something beautiful. I don't think I ever thanked you for that. His words caught me off guard, and I felt a lump rise in my throat. You don't have to thank me, I said quietly. We all needed this in our own way. As he watched the women in the garden. I spent so many years thinking about what I had lost, he said. Your husband, my son, the life we used to have. I let that loss consume me, and in the process, I pushed away the people who were still here, the people who mattered. I placed a hand on his arm, the gesture small but meaningful. You've changed, I said, and that's what matters now. We can't undo the past, but we can decide what we do with the time we have left. He looked at me then, his eyes filled with a mix of regret and gratitude. I'm glad we still have time, he said, to make things right. We stood there for a while longer, the weight of his words settling between us. It felt like closure, the kind that had been a long time coming. Later that evening, the women gathered in the common room for one of our regular meetings. We talked about plans for the coming months, shared updates on projects, and celebrated a few recent successes. One of the women, Priya, had just started her own tailoring business, and another, Kavita, had found a teaching job in the next village. Their triumphs filled the room with a sense of hope and pride, a testament to the resilience that had brought them, and all of us, this far. After the meeting, my son approached me with an idea. We should hold an event, he said, his eyes bright with excitement. Something to bring the community together and showcase everything the women have accomplished. I smiled, the idea already sparking possibilities in my mind. That's a wonderful idea, I said. It could be a chance to show the village what we've built here. Over the next few weeks, we threw ourselves into planning. The women were eager to contribute, coming up with ideas for performances, displays, and even a small market to sell their handmade goods. My father-in-law helped organize the logistics, surprising me with his enthusiasm. It was as though the event had given him a renewed sense of purpose, and seeing him so engaged warmed my heart. The day of the event arrived with clear skies and a crisp breeze. The house and garden were transformed, adorned with colorful decorations and bustling with activity. Villagers from all around came to see what we had built, their curiosity soon turning to admiration as they toured the grounds. The women beamed with pride as they showcased their skills and shared their stories, their voices strong and confident. As I moved through the crowd, greeting guests and ensuring everything ran smoothly, I felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude. This house, which had once been a place of pain and struggle, was now a beacon of hope and strength. It wasn't just a home for me anymore, it was a sanctuary for everyone who walked through its doors. Toward the end of the day, my father in law took me aside. He looked tired but content, a small smile playing on his lips. "This was a good idea," he said. "Seeing everyone come together like this, it's something special." "It is," I agreed, feeling a swell of pride as I looked out at the crowd. "And it's just the beginning." He nodded, his gaze thoughtful. "I never thought I'd see this house like this," he said. "I never thought I'd feel proud of it again." I placed a hand on his shoulder, the gesture unspoken but understood. We had come full circle, and though the journey had been painful, it had brought us here, to this moment of shared pride and purpose. As the sun set and the guests began to leave, I stood in the garden once more, watching the women pack up their displays and chatter excitedly about the day's success. My son joined me, his expression mirroring my own sense of contentment. "We did it, Ma," he said, his voice filled with quiet pride. "We did," I replied, my heart full. The house had been through so much betrayal, loss, and heartache, but it had also become a place of healing and renewal. It was more than just a building now, it was a symbol of resilience, a testament to the strength of those who had fought to save it. And as I stood there, surrounded by the life and love that now filled its walls, I knew we had created something lasting, something worth fighting for. This was our home, and it always would be.